The public is conditioned to look to the sky. Legacy media fixates on the kinetic cost of intercontinental missiles, a narrative reinforced by observed lessons from conflicts like the Russia-Ukraine war. This is a strategic misdirection. The true vector for systemic collapse is not a launch-on-warning scenario. It is silent and absolute. The mathematical certainty is that an insolvent state facing domestic liabilities it cannot service, like Iran with its real in ruin, will not opt for a high-cost, low-probability kinetic exchange. The protocol shifts from military victory to economic leverage. The primary target is not a city, it is the global digital nervous system. CCS reports confirm the extreme vulnerability of the world's subsea data cables. Trillions of dollars in liquidity move through these fiber optic conduits daily. They are the arteries of the global economy. A single, deniable cut is not an act of war, it is a signal, a systemic heart attack engineered to paralyze the financial system. The second vector is orbital, satellite blinding, a temporary or permanent disabling of the adversary's eyes and ears. This is not science fiction. RUSI analysis identifies it as a core component of modern asymmetric doctrine. Without satellite data, markets cannot price risk, precision weapons are inert, and command and control dissolves. You don't need to destroy the Leviathan, you only need to blind it. This creates the blind Leviathan, a superpower stripped of its data supremacy, thrashing in the dark. Its markets freeze, its military logistics fail, and its political structure fractures under the weight of uncertainty. This is the 21st century nuclear option, a kill switch for the global order, triggered not by a missile key, but by an economic and political solvency crisis. The motive is not conquest, it is survival. We incorrectly assess state action through the lens of strength, assuming powerful moves are made from powerful positions. The opposite is true. Catastrophic risk is engineered by weakness. A regime's primary function is to remain solvent. Its capacity to govern must exceed its domestic liabilities. When that equation inverts, the state is functionally bankrupt. Consider the Russian Federation. Analysts at RUSI frame the conflict in Ukraine not as a simple land grab, but as a mandatory expenditure to manage a terminal solvency crisis. The liabilities were mounting: a stagnating economy, declining political legitimacy, and the perceived existential threat of Western encroachment. The war was a high-risk, high-reward gambit to consolidate domestic power and force a new economic settlement with the West. However, the kinetic cost of conventional warfare has proven unsustainable. As the Small Wars Journal documents, the conflict has become a long, hard year, a systemic drain on both military hardware and economic stability. Each destroyed tank, each depleted battalion, is a direct debit from the Kremlin's solvency account, accelerating the very collapse the war was designed to prevent. This is the mathematical certainty of the pivot to asymmetry. When the cost of conventional action guarantees insolvency, the regime is forced to change the game. Nuclear posturing ceases to be abstract deterrence. It becomes a rational, asymmetric tool to generate leverage that cannot be achieved kinetically. The threat is not an act of madness, it is a calculated protocol to stave off internal collapse. Weakness, cornered, becomes the primary vector for global systemic risk. The central equation governing modern conflict is no longer force on force, but cost per kill. This is the blueprint for the economics of lethality. Analysts at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, place the kinetic cost of a legacy asset, a main battle tank, at approximately $5 million. In contrast, the cost of the asset designed to neutralize it, a commercially derived FPV drone, is $500. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost imbalance. This is not a tactical shift, it is a systemic economic event. We are witnessing the rapid democratization of violence, a protocol where lethal standoff capability is decoupled from state-level industrial and financial power. For a regime facing a solvency crisis, this asymmetry is not a bug. It is the primary feature. It provides a low-cost, high-leverage instrument to challenge vastly superior powers, transforming a state of economic collapse into a credible kinetic threat. The mathematical certainty is that as the cost of projecting lethal force approaches zero, its application becomes infinitely more probable. The consensus narrative directs your attention to kinetic friction between Washington and Beijing. This is a deliberate misdirection. The primary vector for systemic collapse is not found in the naval standoff in the South China Sea. It is engineered in the solvency crises of weaker states. The math doesn't lie. The real battlefield is the balance sheet of a failing regime. The blueprint is openly published. Reports from modern Ghana confirm it. Rio in ruin. Iran's protests escalate amid economic crisis and nuclear tensions. This is not two separate events. It is a single causal mechanism. As domestic liabilities, like a collapsing currency, exceed the state's capacity to govern, the regime's calculus shifts from prosperity to survival. The nuclear program ceases to be a bargaining chip. It becomes a solvency protocol, an asymmetric asset to prevent liquidation. These zones of insolvency are not random. They are curated proxy laboratories. CSS and RUSI analysts track how social and economic destabilization tactics are beta-tested in seemingly stable regions. Warnings from places like South Africa or even Canada about infrastructure fragility are not the main event. They are test runs. These are the staging grounds for perfecting the accelerants that will be deployed in the true gray zones, where economic collapse can trigger a kinetic response. The lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, as documented by Small Wars Journal, underscore this shift. The kinetic cost for direct great power confrontation is prohibitive. It depletes capital, materiel, and political will. The logical pivot is to weaponize the insolvency of a third party. Why risk your own assets when you can force your adversary to spend theirs containing a crisis you engineered from a spreadsheet? The question of, will the global order change, posed by Fair Observer, is answered here. The system is designed to fracture at its weakest points. The catastrophic risk the Atlantic warns of is not a missile from a superpower, but a launch-on warning from a state with nothing left to lose. The next global crisis will not be announced by a declaration of war. It will be triggered by a currency default in a nuclear aspirant state. This is a mathematical certainty. The illusion of control over a nuclear arsenal is maintained by a single assumption, that the data is clean. The doctrine of launch-on warning is not a choice. It is a pre-programmed response to a specific data input. A signal of incoming kinetic assets triggers an immediate, irreversible kinetic output. The system is designed to remove human hesitation, which it mistakes for inefficiency. This protocol is a zero-sum calculation. The risk of launching on a false alarm is weighed against the certainty of decapitation if the warning is real and ignored. The decision window is not hours, it is minutes. In that time frame, the primary directive is to guarantee a retaliatory strike, ensuring the mathematical logic of mutually assured destruction holds. The system's integrity depends entirely on the fidelity of its early warning sensors. Enter the fog of digital war. As analysts at RUSI note, and as demonstrated by the extensive use of electronic warfare in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the modern battlespace is defined by signal degradation and data manipulation. A cyber attack does not need to destroy a satellite. It only needs to blind it. It doesn't need to spoof 1,000 missiles, only the one signal that triggers the automated response protocol. The kinetic cost of entry is billions. The cyber cost is negligible. The commander is now operating blind. The main screen shows no signal. The protocol, however, remains active. Is the silence a network failure, or is it the result of enemy action destroying the sensors right before impact? Faced with this ambiguity, the doctrine compels a launch. Now consider a regime facing a solvency crisis, with its currency in ruin and its political legitimacy collapsing, as reports from modern Ghana detail in Iran. For that commander, the ambiguity is not a risk, it's a confirmation of their worst fears. The system is the trap. When a state's domestic liabilities exceed its capacity to govern, it is forced to seek asymmetric leverage. Forcing an adversary's hand via cyber warfare is the ultimate asymmetric tool. It transforms an enemy's strength, its automated rapid response protocol, into a systemic vulnerability. This isn't a mistake, it's a feature. The resulting global catastrophe is not the objective. It is the consequence of a desperate regime externalizing its own insolvency. The launch is the final entry in a crisis ledger. The governing equation is not complex. As a state's domestic liabilities, such as a collapsing currency and escalating civil unrest, exceed its capacity for kinetic projection, the calculus for survival changes. Analysis of Iran's terminal solvency crisis, with its real in ruin and escalating protests, indicates the regime is approaching this inflection point. The lessons learned from the high kinetic cost of the Russia-Ukraine war, as documented by the Small Wars Journal, render conventional military action an inefficient protocol for re-establishing leverage. The logical alternative is an asymmetric economic attack designed for maximum disruption and minimum attribution. This is not an act of war, it is an act of rebalancing, a calibration shot to signal capability without triggering a full-spectrum response. CSS analysis confirms that critical infrastructure nodes, particularly digital logistics backbones, are the primary vector for such an operation. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a logistics blackout at a major European container port. The target will not be the physical assets, but the software managing the flow of goods, a systemic paralysis disguised as a catastrophic IT failure. The event will be a multi-day, attribution-impossible shutdown of a critical hub's container management system, freezing billions in trade. This is the protocol when the cost of domestic failure becomes greater than the risk of foreign reprisal.